Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Write Where It Counts. We are very pleased that you could join WAND for this presentation today, and we're very, very excited to hear from Mary Kaszynski from ReThink Media. My name is Utsi Vokila. I am the Senior Program Associate here at WAND, and I will be running the technology today. Before we get started with the presentation, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees are going to be muted during the presentation. After the presentation, we'll take questions for Mary, and please submit them by typing them into the question section of your panel. It should be on the right-hand side of your computer screen. I'll ask these questions aloud to Mary after she finishes her presentation. The presentation is also going to be recorded and available on our website afterwards for you to review as well. If you're having any technical difficulties at any time, please contact GoToWebinar support directly. Their phone number is 1-800-263-6317. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our presenter, Mary Kaszynski. Mary is the Media Associate for Peace and Security at ReThink Media, and her responsibilities include tracking all press coverage of nuclear weapons issues, Pentagon spending, North Korea, and Iran, and also managing ReThink's research into the journalists that drive peace and security news coverage in the United States. Mary has a wide spectrum of experience at ReThink Media. She's worked at the Stimson Center, at the Plowshares Fund, at the American Security Project, and she's really, really excellent. We're very, very excited to hear from Mary today. So without further ado, I give you Mary Kaszynski from ReThink Media. Mary?
Thank you so much, Audrey. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's training. This is Mary at ReThink Media. Really excited that you all could join us today for this training on how to write and place letters to the editor. Letters are a really fantastic way to get our messages out there into the media, particularly on Pentagon budget and nuke budget issues. Those issues tend to not get a lot of media coverage, which is why we really want to be prepared to take advantage of every opportunity. So today we're going to talk about how to write and place letters to the editor. I'm going to spend some time going through ReThink Media's top 10 tips for writing effective letters. And then we're going to spend some time talking about effective messaging. So what are the really good ways to talk about Pentagon budget and nuke budget in a way that helps you connect with the audience you're trying to reach out to? Before I dive into the top 10 tips, I just want to emphasize one really big point. This is probably the most important thing to keep in mind when you're writing a letter to the editor. And I'll go through it in more detail a little bit later, but wanted to touch on it now right off the bat. This is really the one takeaway. If you have just one takeaway from this presentation, I hope that this is it. So the most important thing to remember when you're writing a letter to the editor is to keep it simple. That means keep it short, stick to one main point, and send it in quickly. If you find yourself spending a ton of time thinking about it and you're writing hundreds and hundreds of words, that may be a sign that what you're writing isn't a letter, but it is an op-ed. And op-eds are fantastic. I definitely encourage you to write those. But if your goal is to write a letter, then you just want to remember to keep it short and sweet. So diving right into our top 10 tips. Number one is to know your audience. That really means a couple of different things. First, it's really important to keep in mind the kind of outlet you're reaching out to. So if you're reaching out to a local outlet, your letter will be stronger if you touch on issues that are specific to your state and to your community. If you're writing to a national outlet like New York Times or Washington Post, then you want to touch on issues that are of national importance that appeal to a broader audience. You also want to be sure to include the title of the original piece, the piece that you're responding to, in the first line of your letter. That really shows the editor that you're serious about this issue because you've been following the paper's coverage. You also want to remember to name your target in the letter. So if your ask or the goal of your letter is to get your representative or your senator to take the lead in ending wasteful Pentagon spending, or if you want them to protect a particularly important nuclear nonproliferation program, then you want to be sure to name that member of Congress and specifically name that program. So all of these things are parts of knowing the audience that you are trying to reach out to. Number 2, keep it brief. This one, again, is really important. Different outlets have different preferences on word count, but the maximum length that they want to see in a letter is usually about 200 words. Sometimes it can be even shorter than that. So the New York Times, for example, asks for 150 words or less. Some outlets, particularly on the local level, will give you a little bit more space. They might give you several hundred words instead of just 200. But the important thing to remember here is to be sure to check the outlet's guidelines before you send in your letter. And if the outlet doesn't have specific guidelines, then just scan the LTE page and get a sense of what that preferred word count is. You also want to be sure to respond quickly to the piece that appeared in your local paper. So papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post get hundreds of letters on everything they publish every day. And they can get thousands of submissions if it's a really controversial topic. I definitely recommend sending in your letter within 24 hours of when the original piece appeared. And if you can get it in within 6 or 7 hours, that's even better, because that means that your letter is going to be one of the first ones that the editor reads, which gives you a higher chance of your letter being printed. So in order to do that, you don't want to spend a ton of time thinking about what you want to write. Just take a step back, think about what your main point is, get it down on paper, and send it in. Again, number 4, focusing on one point. Very, very important when you're writing a letter. So this one can be particularly difficult for those of us who are really passionate about these insecurity issues. I know when I think about Pentagon budget or nuke budget, I get really enthusiastic about it and I want to talk about it on and on and on. But it's really much better when you're writing a letter to focus on one main point. That's going to make your letter much stronger than if you throw in all of the points you can think of, all of the arguments for why this is a good idea. When you're writing a letter, again, you only have about 200 words, so you want to use those words very, very carefully to build the strong case for your one point. Personalizing your message is also a really, really good idea. So think about a little bit, why does this issue matter to you? Your voice means more if you can connect your story to this issue that you care about. So for those of you who are involved in politics, this is a good opportunity to make sure to list your title at the end of your letter, or to include your personal story within the text of the letter. And you can do the same thing if you're a teacher or a parent or whatever your connection is to your local community. Telling a personal story is really, really important for those of us in this community, because one of the frames that we struggle to break out of is the stereotype of being called a liberal activist. So our opponents really love to use this stereotype when they're referring to us. And that's because when you call someone a liberal activist, they sound right away like they're separate from the rest of the community. And that allows our opponents to make these claims like, well, she's a liberal activist, she's separate from the rest of the community, she doesn't understand the troops, she doesn't understand that we're at war, why should we listen to her? We can turn that stereotype around when we share our personal experiences, because that shows that actually we are a part of the community. We do understand. We understand why national security is important. We support our troops. We want to keep America safe too. Number 6, remember to be polite when you're writing your letter. This kind of goes without saying, but it is important to keep in mind. You can definitely be critical of the position that the paper has taken or the argument that the author of the op-ed makes, but you just want to keep your criticism in a civil tone. This is really important because sometimes very angry letters will get published, but that can be a little bit counterproductive because it makes you look a little bit crazy, when what you want to do is be the voice of reason in this debate. Proofread. Again, this one's really important. I know I talked before about the importance of submitting your letter quickly, and that's definitely very important, but it's equally important to make sure that you proof your letter very, very carefully for these really small grammar mistakes. Some papers will edit your piece for punctuation and typos, but sometimes they don't edit, and you really don't want any of those embarrassing little typos to make it into print. Really the best way to avoid typos is to get another set of eyes on your letter before you send it in. Just having another person take a look at it can be really, really helpful to make sure that your letter's coherent, it makes sense, and you're not leaving out any really important words. Include your contact info. That's really key when you're submitting a letter. They can't publish your letter if they can't reach you. So you want to be sure to include your cell phone number. For some reason, editors really like to contact people outside of office hours. I'm not sure why it is, but it seems like 5 o'clock hits, everyone goes home, and editors start making phone calls. So make sure to include your cell phone number. You also want to include your physical address, and you want to make sure that your address is within the target area of the outlet that you're reaching out to. So if you're writing to a national paper, New York Times, Washington Post, you can live anywhere. But if you're writing to a local paper, you want to be within a reasonable local area. So if you're in LA and you're writing to the Portland Press Herald in Maine, you're going to have a harder time of your letter being accepted than if you actually live within Maine. Volume. This one is a little bit counterintuitive, but volume actually really, really helps us when it comes to letters to the editor. So if a lot of us send in letters on the same topic or the same article or editorial, that increases our chances of getting at least one of those letters placed. It also can affect the editorial calendar of that outlet, and that means that the ed board or the outlet might weigh in on an issue more often than they otherwise would, because they see this volume of letters and they realize that a lot of people out there really care about reducing the Pentagon budget. This can also have an impact on what position they take on this issue. So if an outlet gets several letters from us on the importance of eliminating wasteful Pentagon spending, the next time they write an editorial on this issue, they're going to be more likely to adopt our messaging. Last but not least, keep trying. Sometimes your letters will be accepted, sometimes they won't, and that's okay. The important thing is to keep trying. So outlets get hundreds of letters every day. They can't publish every single one they receive. But writing effective LTEs is more about persistence and dedication than anything else. So if your letter doesn't get picked up, don't worry about it. Just try again, and you might get in next time. It's all about the long game here. The more letters you write, the better you'll get, the faster you'll get, and the more likely we'll succeed in the long run. So now that we've talked about some of the brass tacks, the top tips of writing letters to the editor, let's talk a little bit about some of the messaging that works really well when we're talking about Pentagon and nuke budget. I'm not sure if they still do, but this is a really, really good example of how to frame the debate in an effective and memorable way. So the guys on the right are clearly the old, outdated PCs. Nobody wants to be one of those PCs. The guy on the right is the new cool Mac. he's the one that everyone wants to choose. So they've set up this narrative where there's a good guy, there's a bad guy, and it's very clear which one you want to choose, which one is the right answer. So let's see how this idea of framing the debate and offering a clear choice plays out when we're talking about Pentagon budget and nuke budget. I'm going to go through this slide a little bit quickly. John McCain doesn't look too happy with me right now. So the defense hawks, our opponents, actually have a pretty easy, when it comes to Pentagon budget. It's a pretty easy frame. Russia, China, and Iran, they're the bad guys. America, we're the good guy. And it's a very clear message. More money equals more security. Now, obviously, it's a simplistic message. It's overly simplistic. But it is pretty effective. And that's because it lays out this clear choice between security and strength and freedom on the one side, and on the other side, weakness and decline and appeasement. They've set up the choice. It's clear which way you want to go from their perspective. Now, our frame is, of course, a little bit different. When we create this frame, we have the opportunity to redefine the choice that our readers are facing. So our frame says that the real threat here is wasteful spending. Wasteful spending is our #1 national security threat. And the contractors and the lobbyists and the ICBM caucus, all of those people who want to continue this wasteful spending, they're the bad guys. They're the ones who are putting our national security at risk. They're the ones who are out of touch with reality. So this allows us to position ourselves as being the ones who are strong on defense. We're the ones who want to bring America's national security strategy forward. We're the ones who understand 21st century threats, and we know what it's going to take to keep America safe. Now, one of the things that we struggle with when we're talking about Pentagon budget and nuke budget, this is a really good frame, but when you're talking about budgets, it's really easy to get stuck in the details, in the numbers. And we don't want to get bogged down in the numbers because that prevents us from connecting with our audience. People think in different ways, but they don't think often in terms of numbers. They think in terms of experiences and ideas and connections. So that's what we're trying to emphasize when we talk about budgets. Storytelling and imagery can be a really, really effective way for talking about Pentagon and nuke budget. A story is always preferable to numbers because, again, it's something that people can relate to and identify with. That's particularly true if you're reaching out to members of your community. It allows you to make connections between complicated issues in the community that you all are a part of. And this is why fables and parables are so timeless. So if you say something like, "The boy who cried wolf," everyone immediately understands what you're trying to say. It's much more effective than saying something like, "You shouldn't say something bad unless something bad is really happening because otherwise no one will believe you." That's just clunky and you're going to lose readers. If you put it in a very clear way, something everyone can understand and refer to, that's going to be a much better way of connecting with your audience and avoiding those numbers. Metaphors and analogies are also a really, really effective way for talking about Pentagon and nuke budget because they allow us to relate these complicated topics back to something that everyone understands and can identify with. I really, really like this particular letter to the editor. This one came out around the New START debate. And it's a really great letter because the author could have focused on what our nuclear arsenal looked like during the Cold War and what it looks like now, or she could have gotten stuck in all the details about what the New START treaty does and why it's really important. But she skipped all of that. She cut right to the point and she said, she's from Iowa. So she said, look, times have changed. We don't grow corn the same way we used to. We should update our nuclear weapons policy as well because times have changed. So that's something that everybody in her audience immediately got and identified with. They know it's true. They were nodding, yep, times have changed. We do need to update our nuclear weapons policy. It was short, simple, and to the point, She really cut through that complicated argument and said it in a clear way that everyone understood. Now, obviously, analogies don't have to be just about corn. There are a lot of different categories that you can work with. Food, sports, pop culture, music, whatever people are talking about, whatever is important to them right now in their life, you can use that to help them understand the complicated issues that we are talking about. Now I want to touch a little bit on a couple of tips that are specific for Pentagon Budget and Nuke Budget. First, when we're talking about these issues, it's really important to talk about reducing the Pentagon budget instead of the military budget or the defense budget. So when we say something about cutting the military budget, we're alienating our readers because most people will assume that when you say cutting the military budget, that you mean cutting programs that benefit the troops and their family. So you're alienating your readers right away when you say military budget, because support for the military is very, very strong for Americans. The Pentagon, on the other hand, is a very different thing from the military or the troops. When you say the Pentagon, that sounds really mysterious, sounds impersonal, even a little bit elitist. And that's not something that most people are going to identify with. So already when you say Pentagon budget, they're going to be more disposed to listen to your argument. Point number two, it's often really important to talk about addressing 21st century threats when you're talking about Pentagon and Nuke budget. So this frame allows us to create that choice that we were talking about earlier. It's a choice between old, outdated weapons and real security in the 21st century. And this opens up a whole opportunity for really developing this frame. So you can be one of those people who wants to waste billions of dollars on outdated nuclear programs. You can pretend that we're stuck in the 1980s. You can pretend to duck and cover all you want, but it's not going to help and it makes you look a little bit silly. These are all part of that way that we want to frame the opposition. And that allows us then to take the high ground of being the national security experts. So we are the ones who recognize the threats that we actually face. We are the ones who recognize that the security environment has changed. And we're the ones who are going to make America safe when we're thinking about these threats that we actually face in the 21st century. So this very clearly lays out the frame. Do we want to be stuck in the past, or do we want to move forward into the 21st century? Last but not least, budget trade-offs. This is one of my favorite parts of Pentagon budget and Nuke budget messaging, and that's because it's really easy to personalize this argument. So trade-offs are really key to the Nuke budget and Pentagon budget messaging, because trade-offs are something everyone gets right away. And that's because we make trade-offs every day, right? So I could have ice cream for lunch, or I could have a glass of wine for dinner, but I can't do both. Or I could stay up all night watching TV, or I could get a good night's sleep and be awake the next day, but I can't do both. These are the kinds of things that we think about every day. We think about the costs and consequences of the choices that we're making. We want to encourage our readers to think about those choices when we talk about Pentagon budget and Nuke budget. There's also a lot of flexibility in this messaging. So some of our right-leaning friends like to make this guns versus guns argument. So they might say something like, you can spend billions of dollars on outdated nuclear weapons, or you can invest in the programs that our troops need in Afghanistan. Or alternatively, on the progressive side, you can make that guns versus butter trade-off and say something like, instead of wasting billions on outdated nuclear weapons programs, we should be investing in education and the economy. Those are the programs that really keep America safe. So again, just to recap these important points for messaging Pentagon budget and Nuke budget, you do always want to say Pentagon budget. Try not to say military or defense budget. Remember to talk about the 21st century choice. What we want to do is move America into the 21st century. And these budget trade-offs can be really, really helpful. A good way to emphasize this clear choice, the choice that our readers are facing. As a final exercise, I just want to go quickly through some really good examples of recent letters to the editor. I'm going to look at 2 letters, and these both have really good elements that we've already talked about today. So this one is a letter that appeared recently in the Washington Post. There are a couple of really, really good elements here. You can see that it names the program right away, CF35. It names the targets, McCain and Levin. It hits the 21st century theme right away because it's talking about cyber attacks. And it establishes the author's credentials as a national security expert, someone who cares about America and keeping our troops safe. It establishes that right away because she clearly says in the first paragraph she wants to keep our troops and ourselves safe. You'll also see in the second paragraph that she's completely avoided talking about budget numbers, but she does have a really catchy fact here about the F-35 being the most expensive weapon system in history. That's a really good way to avoid a number that your readers are never going to remember. And it substitutes this fun, catchy fact that readers will remember walking away. Also really good to note, this letter is very clear and to the point. It makes one main point, and it's right in the headline. So if you read only the headline, nothing else, you already understand what it is that the author is trying to say. That's a sign that you've got a really strong letter. I also really like this example of a letter to the editor. So you'll notice that this one is a local outlet, it's the Columbus Dispatch. And this is in response to an Associated Press story. That's really important to note. There's a common misperception that letters to the editor have to be in response to an opinion piece or an editorial. That's actually not true. You can send in a letter on anything that your paper has published. That's a really good thing for us because when we're talking about Pentagon budget and nuke budget, those are issues that have far more wire stories, so the Associated Press and Reuters are far more likely to cover nuke budget and Pentagon budget news. You're going to see far more of those than you'll see editorials and op-eds. So I definitely recommend that you keep an eye out for these wire stories, particularly coming up in the budget process. So one of the next big opportunities is going to be the National Defense Authorization Act, and we're going to see several wire stories coming out of that legislation, and they're going to get picked up in local papers across the country. So just keep an eye out for those and be prepared to respond. This letter in particular is really good for a couple of reasons. Again, we've got the target right up front. We've got a nice story in the second paragraph. So no one's really heard of this nuclear nonproliferation program. So the author tells a story to explain what it is that this program does. It's a story that's really easy to visualize. It's easy to remember, easy to understand why this program is important. I also really like that in the third paragraph, it lays out the budget trade-offs very, very clearly. So while funding for nuclear nonproliferation is decreasing, funding for nuclear weapons program is increasing. And this lays out that really clear trade-off, right? So we can spend money on nuclear bombs, or we can spend money preventing nuclear terrorism, but we can't do both. This is a clear choice, and it's clear which one you want to choose. Finally, again, I just want to highlight that this piece does a really good job of making one point, one main argument. She lays it out right up front, and then she spends the next 150, 200 words really building the case for this one main point. So I'm going to stop the presentation here. As I mentioned before, the National Defense Authorization Act is going to be a really good opportunity for writing letters to the editor coming up. So I hope these tips were helpful. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy now. She's going to talk a little bit more about what WAND has planned around the NDA.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was really, really helpful. Before we hear from Kathy, I just wanted to remind everyone how to submit questions for Mary. You can type them in using the question panel on your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and then I'll ask them out loud to Mary after we hear from Kathy. Kathy?
Thank you. And thank you so much, Mary. It was a really excellent presentation, very clear and lots of great tips for us. And we timed this intentionally to happen right before the National Defense Authorization Act that Mary mentioned will be considered by the House of Representatives on the floor next week. And I just want to say a word about the process of the NDAA and how quickly it will go, so that you are anticipating that. And what I can't do, unfortunately, is give you a list of what amendments will be and what specific things are going to be debated. And I don't know that anybody will be able to give those to you in a real clear way ahead of time. So that's one of the reasons why we thought that thinking about letters to the editor, responding quickly to what happens on the Defense Authorization Bill would be probably the best way that we could get our message out about this. So the Defense Authorization Bill is the bill that sets the policy and allows for funding for the Pentagon, the Defense Department's base budget, also the nuclear weapons funding and war spending. It is the authorization process, not the appropriations process. We'll get another opportunity to weigh in when the appropriations bill comes out, and I always tell people the appropriations is where you actually write the checks for the programs. But the authorization bill is very important because there is an enormous amount of policy debate around the issues, and it's not limited to just adding money here or there. But one of the disadvantages of the way that this bill is managed on the House floor is that there's a specific way that amendments have to be offered, and that is that they have to be written up ahead of time, and then there's a rule that's devised to determine which amendments will be allowed in. And so it makes for a difficult process in terms of knowing what specific amendments will happen. But we do know that there will be a debate about spending levels for the Pentagon, whether or not how much money we're going to be spending on Afghanistan, how much money we're going to be spending on nuclear weapons. And we anticipate that there will be press coverage of these, and they might be, just like the letter that Mary showed responding to the AP story in the Columbus Dispatch. It might be a very brief story, or it might be a more targeted story about the particular member of Congress that was sponsoring an amendment or something specific to the program. So we're hoping that you will keep your eyes peeled in your local newspapers to see what is covered and be able to respond quickly. We will also be tracking kind of what's happening on the NDAA as it goes along on our WAND website, and we'll send you more information about that in the follow-up materials. So I don't want to take too much more time because I know you probably have lots of questions for Mary about how to write excellent letters to the editor. So I am going to go ahead and turn it back over to Udzi to read out some of your questions.
Thank you, Kathy. So we do have a number of questions from the audience. Our first question is from Rosemary Pace. Rosemary asks, there are times I specifically don't give my title when submitting a letter because I know, being a director of a peace organization, that editors can dismiss my point of view and not be interested in publishing my letter. What do you recommend in such a situation?
Rosemary, thanks for that. That's a really, really good question. My answer would be that it really depends on the outlet you're reaching out to. So you're very right to be conscious about your branding, If you are affiliated with a peace organization, you don't want that to count against you with the editor. So if you're reaching out to a national paper, or if you're reaching out to a paper that you know has a right-leaning slant, you might want to leave out that particular title, and that's fine. You just want to be sure to include your address and your cell phone number, and that can be enough to get your letter in. It doesn't have to depend on your title. If, on the other hand, you're reaching out to a more progressive outlet, your title can actually help you, and then you do want to be sure to include it. So your instincts are exactly right on this.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question is from Sarah Whitford. Sarah says, anecdotal evidence would suggest that if you have a letter published once, you are likely to get picked up again on a second or third or fourth submission. Is this true?
That's another really, really good question. And again, I would say that it's really important to check the outlet's guidelines. So some outlets really, really like having repeat letter submitters, letter writers. And those editors will establish a relationship with you. So if you write one really good letter, and then you write again, they're going to recognize your name and be more likely to read and publish your letter. So it's definitely good to establish that relationship by continuing to submit letters over time. However, you do want to be a little bit careful. You want to check the outlet's guidelines, because some outlets specifically will not publish letters from the same author more than, say, once per month. But if they have that kind of a rule, they'll be very clear about it. It will be in their guidelines. And they'll say something like, we'll only publish one letter per author per month, or something like that. So then you won't spend the time. You can hold off and wait till the next month for the next opportunity, but you just want to be aware of what their stance is on this issue.
Thank you. Our next question, is there as much readership online as there is in hard copy versions of newspapers?
Ooh, that's another really good one. The short answer is that it depends. And every outlet is going to be different, right? So some outlets have actually moved to being all online. Some outlets have moved behind a paywall. So you do want to bear that in mind when you're writing your letter and you're looking for an outlet. Of course, you would prefer to reach the widest audience possible, but it's also good to craft a letter that's particular to the outlet that you're reaching out to. And sometimes those statistics on readership can be hard to find. So my recommendation would be to spend a little bit of time reading through the outlet if it's not one that you're particularly familiar with, to become aware of what their position is. And then keep the readership in mind, but don't make that a priority when you're thinking about submitting a letter.
Thank you. Mary, can you tell us a little bit more about timing? Specifically, if for whatever reason you miss kind of that 24-hour window of opportunity to respond to an article or an op-ed, is it still worth it to try and submit anyway?
I would say absolutely. It's always worth a try. The 24-hour rule is really more a rule of thumb than anything else. If it's been more than, say, 3 days, I would say you probably missed the window for your letter getting in. It can be really difficult, particularly with so many outlets moving towards online versions. It can be difficult to keep up with when a paper has published an article that's relevant to what you want to talk about. And it can be confusing to tell when an article's been published. The New York Times, for example, sometimes they backdate their articles. So an article appears on the 13th online, but it was actually published the day before. So again, keep the 24-hour rule in mind, but don't let it dictate really too much when you submit your letter. If you're within, I would say, 48 hours, it's worth still trying. Even within 3 days, I would say it's worth still trying to get your letter in.
Great. Our next question is from Martin Fleck. Martin asks that you noted that editors are often calling to verify authorship after 5 p.m. What kind of shift does a letters editor typically work?
That's a really good question. Thank you for that, Martin. Letters or editors' office hours vary a lot depending on the outlet. I'm not sure why, but it does seem that editors seem to work more often in the evening. That tends to be true for a lot of media professionals these days, and that's just a function of the 24-hour news cycle. My experience, just anecdotally, does seem to be that editors tend to call more often in the evenings, but that could also be because of time differences as well. So the short answer is I'm not sure when their official office hours are, but you do want to be prepared for those calls that might come in at, 6, 7, 8 o'clock. It's always good to get a call from an editor, even if it's not technically your office time.
All right. Our next question is from Bob Farquhar. Bob asks, is it appropriate to directly address the moral issue of nuclear weapons, or leave that for the reader to get from between the lines?
Sure, that's a really, really excellent question. From a strictly messaging perspective, generally, Americans tend to respond better to arguments about nuclear weapons that refer to their security importance. So polling shows that most Americans do want to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that we have. But at the same time, they also believe that nuclear weapons are essential. That's the actual word they use in the polling. Something like 80% of Americans believe that nuclear weapons are essential for American security. It's a really high number. We want to keep that in mind when we're writing letters or op-eds. We want to play to this belief that Americans hold very, very strongly. So all of that is to say that Americans are more likely to agree with you. Your audience is more likely to accept your argument if you make the case that the number of nuclear weapons that we have is out of step with our security needs in the 21st century. The moral argument is also very important, and if that's something that you strongly believe, and that's something that's very important to your brand and your organization's identity, then you shouldn't shy away from that argument. So you want to stay true to what your beliefs are. All of that said, if you're able to frame it in a way that's more security-oriented, that tends to be an argument that will more likely resonate with a wider audience.
Thank you, Barry. That was very insightful. Our next question is more of a logistical question. Earlier you mentioned that a volume of letters can change the stance of an outlet on an issue, or can cause an outlet to take a stance on an issue or cover it more. Can you share any real-world examples of this occurring?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. So one really good example that comes from work that I know Wand has done on this issue, the F-35, that's an important program, very, very expensive program that many of us would like to work to reduce because it's unnecessary, super expensive, over budget, all of those bad things. We worked with a community of activists in Burlington, Vermont, to reach out to their local paper, the Burlington Free Press. This was a really, really fantastic campaign because the Burlington Free Press is basically the only game in town when it comes to media. It's the BFP or nothing. So we worked with local advocates to submit letters and op-eds and really convey to the editorial board that this is an important issue for members of the community. And because of this activism, because of this media work, the editorial board actually began to take a very strong interest in the F-35. The issue was whether the F-35 would be based in Burlington, Vermont. And because of the volume of letters and op-eds that the editors received, they actually took a position, they hadn't taken a position before, but they became the watchdogs of this issue. So they reached out to members of Congress. Senator Leahy and I don't remember who the other ones are, to try to get answers on why they're moving forward with this program when there's so much opposition to it. They asked really good, hard questions, and they became enthusiastic and interested in asking those questions and following through on this issue because of the media work that had been done by members of the community. So that's just one example, and there are many more. It's a really good way for us to all work together to get our issues heard and understood by editors.
So just to sort of follow up on that question, Mary, do congressional offices really pay attention to letters to the editor? And is this really an effective way to get them to consider changing their stance on a policy issue?
Yes, absolutely. That's an excellent question. Short answer is yes. Members of Congress, and particularly their staff, they do pay very close attention to what's written in local papers and national papers. The communications director of any member of Congress, their goal is to make their boss look good. So you can bet that every communications director has a Google alert on their boss's name. And every time something is written about their boss, they're getting it in their inbox. So again, that's why naming your target is particularly important. They are paying attention. It's also a really good idea to work with your advocacy team, so your lobbying directors, to make sure that they're getting that information to members of staff, because every once in a while something will slip through the cracks. And we do want to work very closely with the legislative team, the comms team and the leg team working together to make sure that our work is having an impact. But it absolutely does. Just as one particular example, we worked a year or so ago with one of our validators in this community to publish a piece on the Global Threat Reduction Initiative, which was the subject of an LTE that we just walked through. That letter, which was, I believe it was published in the Washington Times, possibly the New York Times, whatever the outlet was, Dianne Feinstein walked into her office the morning that paper was published with a copy of this paper. And she put it down on her desk and said, we need to work to get the funding back for this program, and I'm going to do it because I'm the chair of the Appropriations Committee and I will protect this program. We heard that directly from her staff. So in fact, it does work. We do have examples of very direct impact from letters and opinion pieces.
It's good to know that they actually read what we're writing.
Absolutely.
So our next question is about, do letters to the editor have to respond to a story that's in the paper, or could you submit something around a holiday like the 4th of July or Mother's Day, something that we know will probably get news coverage?
Sure, yeah, that's another really good question. Traditionally, and for most outlets, letters are in response to something. So you can, if you know that a holiday is coming up, you can craft your letter in advance and then submit it, alter it, tweak it at the end when you see that piece that does come out. Tweak it to be in response to a particular piece on that holiday. That's one way to make sure that your letter will be in response to something. That's generally a good idea. You'll generally have more success if it's in response to something. That said, I have had experiences where letters were accepted that were not in response to something. They're just about a current issue. And my advice would be just to be familiar with that outlet and what the outlet's stance is. So if you scan the letter to the editor section in your paper, and absolutely everything is in response to something, then that's a sign that that's probably what the editor wants to see. It's not hard and fast. You can still try. Trying is always good. But it's just a sign that it might be a good idea to wait for something that relates to your piece. On the other hand, if you look at the LTE section, and it seems to be more of a community voices on current events section, then you can give that a try, definitely. Definitely feel free to do that. It all depends on what your outlet is looking for.
Great, thank you. If you write an op-ed and you hear that it's going to be submitted, is it a helpful strategy to go ahead and line up others who support your view to write letters to the editor supporting the op-ed?
Absolutely, that's a fantastic idea. This is something that we always want to do. The only difficulty that we face is finding people who are passionate enough about this issue to be prepared and to take the time to do that. If you can do that, that's a wonderful idea. Very, very good to try to do that.
Great. So a few people have questions kind of about following up with the editor. So does the letters editor have the final say in choosing which letters will be run, or are there other people involved? And to that end, is it effective or helpful to follow up with a call to the editor once you've submitted a letter?
Sure, that's a really good question. And again, I'm going to say it depends. A lot of outlets these days have online submission forms. So unless you're really familiar with the editor already from whatever, from outside of the office or from previous interaction with them on op-eds, I would recommend just submitting it through the proper channels, so submitting it through the online form. And usually the paper will prefer to review the letter and then reach out to you if they're submitted, if they're accepted. So in most cases, it's a good idea to hold off and wait for them to contact you. The exception, of course, is if you do have a personal relationship with the editor, and you can give them a day or two, consider the letter, see if they have time to review it. And if you want to follow up with a personal email, if you have their contact information or their phone number, you can feel free to do that, just depending on your relationship. I would also say that ReThink has a list of about 100 top outlets in the country. So we've collected all this information about who to send the letter to and things like that. And if you ever need any of that contact information, you can feel free to reach out to us.
Great. Well, thank you so very much, Mary. I think that was a really, really insightful presentation and really great answers to those questions from the audience. So we appreciate your time and all the great information. And thank you again to everyone who joined us at home on the webinar. Please be on the lookout for some follow-up materials. Mary was kind enough to put together a quick sheet with all the tips that she went over today, so we'll be emailing that to you. And once you exit the webinar, there's going to be a survey that will pop up on your screen, and we would appreciate and welcome any feedback that you have about today's presentation. So again, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Mary, and we're going to end the webinar there.